I couldn't be happier today than to be on this particular Zoom call with my good friend, Elizabeth Schrader-Polczer. She is the assistant or associate professor, assistant or associate.
Assistant. Once
That's
I
what I
will
thought.
get tenure, I hope.
Now assistant professor at Villanova University in New Testament, and longtime cottage viewers and readers will certainly know that her research has centered around Mary Magdalene, and we've been following it here for oh my gosh, three years.
Four.
Oh,
4 years.
it was the summer you got married.
Yes.
Yeah, that I called you up and asked you if I could present your research in the style of a sermon at the Wild Goose Festival. And I preached it. And ever since then, people have linked that sermon and me in some level to your work, which is does nothing but give me pleasure because I think that you've done just amazing work in this field. And so I wanted to begin by saying hi and welcome back.
Hi, Diana. Yes, it's great to be here. And I also want to thank you for bringing my work to the attention of so many. I think it's about 1 million people that have heard it as a result, maybe more because there's others who have shared it as well. So it's actually kind of gone out to a pretty wide audience thanks to your spotlighting it. So I really appreciate that.
It's kind of astonishing. I was laughing about this because the three sermons in recent years that have been preached that have reached the widest audience, the sermons preached by progressive Christians, have been preached by Michael Curry, which was the wedding sermon of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, and then this sermon on Mary Magdalene about your research and that of Marianne Buddy, the Bishop of Washington. And
Oh
so
my
what I think,
gosh,
I
that's
know,
really good company.
well, I have to laugh.
Oh,
That's three Episcopalians.
yeah. Gotta love the Episcopalians. Yeah. I mean, we're good people. We're good people.
And who says we can't preach, apparently?
Good point.
So what I want to start with here today is there will be listeners that join us who aren't familiar with your thesis. I usually refer to your thesis now as the single sister thesis of John chapter 11. I'm not sure that that's a name that's stuck more widely than my community, but I think that it's a great short descriptor of your work. And I want you to take a couple minutes and fill people in on the original thesis. And I mean, it's provocative in and of itself.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So, a lot of people know that I started out as a singer-songwriter, which was, and it does start there. So I should mention that I had written this song sort of out of the blue about Mary Magdalene. And I have a record called Magdalene and a music video. And I just got really interested in Mary Magdalene as a result of this song. And I had no training. I was a music major in college. And I had grown up going to Episcopal church, so I knew some things, but I was not an expert, and I was a layperson. And so I decided, okay, well, I wrote this song about Mary Magdalene. I want to find out about her, and so I sort of started researching her. And somewhere along the line, I got this idea. I said, I really want to see the world's oldest copy of the Gospel of John. That was just a thought that for some reason stuck out to me because I knew that that was the gospel where she has the biggest scene where Jesus appears to her first on Easter morning in John chapter 20. And I just wondered, I wonder if anything was changed. I wonder if anything was changed along the way. And in retrospect, this was a rather presumptuous thought for a singer-songwriter to have because there are professionals who look very carefully at these things. And, if they had found something, surely they would have told us, right? So, but for whatever reason, I didn't know all that. I just wanted to look at the world's oldest copy. And, if you Google, you find out that, there's a little fragment of the Gospel of John called Papyrus 52, but it just has a couple verses. If you want to look at the biggest sort of complete copy of John, it's Papyrus 66. It was discovered in the 1950s, and people started to discuss it in the 1960s. And it's, of course, in Greek, which is the language of composition of the Gospel of John. And so I said, oh, I really want to look at that. I want to look at Papyrus 66 and see what it says. I hadn't considered that, I had no training. I didn't read Greek. I didn't know anything about textual criticism. I just wanted to look at that manuscript. And I was put in touch with Deirdre Good at General Theological Seminary, and she sent me a link to a transcription of Papyrus 66. And I looked at it, I'm like, oh, this is all in Greek. Didn't anybody translate it? And I was like, ah, what a pain. And I suppose this is sort of a clue that there was more that was going to happen for me because I didn't stop. I actually just found an interlinear study Bible online, and I really wanted to go through every passage of Papyrus 66 and compare it to, what the Bible says, right? And so I had sort of two browser windows open. One was to the transcription of Papyrus 66 that Deirdre had sent me. It was on the University of Birmingham, England had created this website where you could see the transcription of all the words in the papyrus. And then in the other browser window, I had an interlinear study Bible where each Greek word was translated into English. So I started, of course, in John chapter 20. That's the scene between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and everything looked like it was supposed to look. I said, okay. And so then I said, well, what about John 19? That's the scene where Mary Magdalene is at the cross. And everything there said basically what it was supposed to say. And those are kind of Mary Magdalene's scenes in the Gospel of John. And I was like, oh, I was like, I guess I was wrong. I was like, oh, but you know what? I should just check John chapter 11 because I had read in this little commentary by Raymond Brown that some people think that Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, is Mary Magdalene. That is something that in the history of the church, many people have thought. I said, well, doesn't look like there's anything amiss here, but I should just check John chapter 11. And it was the last place I looked, and I had almost given up. So then I go to the window of John 11 and I see the transcription, and I'm like, whoa, you can see that there's all these crossouts and changes in the text. At the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. And I could compare the Greek to the English, and I could see very clearly that the name Maria, that is Mary, had been changed to say Martha. And in Greek, it's only the difference of one letter. Maria, Maria, was changed to M-A-R and then the theta, T-H-A. So Martha, Maria was changed to Martha. And then just a few verses later, I could see that a woman's name had been really like badly scratched out. It was a woman's name. And then it was replaced with these Greek words, Hi Adelphi. So I go to my interlinear study Bible that says that means the sisters. So there was a woman who had a name and she's erased and she becomes the sisters. Now I had gone to church enough to know, okay, wait, isn't Martha in a different story, in a different gospel? In the Gospel of Luke, there's a story of two sisters named Mary and Martha. And so I thought to myself, okay, wait, are they taking that character Martha from Luke's gospel and sticking her in to John's gospel? I should mention that Papyrus 66 is usually dated to around the turn of the 3rd century. It's hard to date because it's only the handwriting. Nobody said like, I copied this on this date. We don't have that. We can just look at the handwriting. And the handwriting appears to be from the late 2nd or early 3rd century. Usually people say circa 200 AD.
Right.
Okay. So I said, well, that's, over 100 years after the gospel was probably written.
But
And
that's
so,
early in
oh,
New
it's the
Testament
oldest.
studies.
It's like it's the oldest that we can really get for a
Right.
substantial chunk of this gospel. It's fantastically early. I mean, it was very exciting when Papyrus 66 was discovered. Um, but it was there was like sort of a flurry of interest in it, and then people sort of went silent on it after it was published. The reason why is because Papyrus 66 has 450 corrections made to it. Hmm. And so that means that there's a couple factors here to consider with Papyrus 66. The scribe did make mistakes. So the thing is that it's very, very early. And also the scribe made mistakes. So you have these two factors happening simultaneously. It seems that the scribe has access to different forms of the text. This is something that other scholars had noticed before me. They said it seems that this scribe has access to two exemplars. So, this is our oldest copy of John that today we have access to, but that copyist had access to two, which at that time would have been a big deal because every manuscript is made by hand. Of course, there's no printing press, so it's all copies of copies of copies. And each copy takes, I don't know how long, I don't know, a week or something to copy it. So think about how much labor it takes just to get a copy of the Gospel of John. So this person had access to two copies, which at that time would have been a wealth of information. And so this copyist sees two different copies of John, and scholars have agreed, okay, so the scribe is copying from one of them and using the other exemplar to correct.
Right. So they're trying to interweave two different manuscripts that are in front of them and create a single manuscript
Mhm.
that then can be sent out, or whoever wanted
Yeah.
that manuscript and whoever hired that scribe to do this.
Or
So,
they might have done it for themselves.
yeah, or they might
It's
have done it for
impossible to know.
themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but at this, it's the scribe is trying to make an accurate copy. That
Right.
seems to be what's going on. And the scribe has beautiful handwriting, so it tells you that it's a trained scribe. But at the same time, the scribe is seeing like every single handwritten copy is going to have mistakes. So there will be some mistakes, of course. But not only that, around this time, around the turn of the third century, the scribe is encountering multiple versions of the text in certain places. Okay. And so those 450 corrections, a lot of them are just mistakes, but some of them are substantive. Like one of the more interesting ones is when it's starting to talk about the supper in Bethany. Usually it says 6 days before the Passover, but Papyrus 66 changes it to say 5 days before the Passover. That's interesting. Okay. So, I mean, it sounds as though one of the copies said six and one of the copies had five. And the scribe is making a new copy and has to choose which one am I going to say? It's sort of it's tricky. The scribe has to sort of adjudicate to make a new copy. And this is just the nature of textual transmission in antiquity.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for people to know. Um, uh, can we move to what you then, from finding all of this messiness in the
Yeah.
text, um, what you presented, what your theory is
Yeah.
about it, and that was really the thing that started you on the next step of the journey.
Yes. So when I found this, the changes of the Mary crossed out maybe a couple times and the woman split in two, I said, oh my gosh, like, so what have scholars done about this? And the answer was they haven't really done anything.
That to
Um,
me is amazing, right there.
yeah, I mean, they had put it in some articles. They said, oh, look, the name Mary's been changed to Martha. Oh, a woman's been split in two. Interesting. And that was the end of the scholarship in the 1960s. Even the very best textual critics at that time, Marie-Émile Boimard in France and Gordon Fee in the United States, they saw it and they said, this is the strangest change in the whole papyrus. They knew how strange it was. But then that's all they said. They didn't really do much. And so I sent it to Deirdre Good, and then I ended up sending to other scholars like Karen King and Elaine Pagels. I said, look at this. And they all said, oh, interesting. And I was like, what did this, why are you not as excited about this? And now being a scholar myself, where people send me randos on the internet, send me things. And I wasn't aware at that time that scholars plan their writing years in advance sometimes. So you can't just like bring something to a scholar and say, write about this. That's not how it works. I mean, I know what I'm going to be writing about for the next 2 years, right? And so I basically realized if anybody's going to do anything about this, it's going to be me. I have to do it. And my best friend Kelly was like, Libby, you've got to go to seminary and get a degree and learn Greek. I was like, what? No, I'm a musician. That sounds annoying. So I sort of, but I was obsessed. I couldn't stop thinking about it. So after, I think I found the change in like May 2012. And then in September of 2013, I kind of, I was just thinking about it. I did eventually matriculate at General Theological Seminary, and Deirdre was my supervisor. And I wrote this master's thesis about, I thought it was going to be on the changes in Papyrus 66. That's what I thought I was going to seminary to do. Um, but actually, as I learned Greek and as I took more classes, other professors were like, well, have you looked at the old Latin manuscripts? And I'm like, what are the old Latin manuscripts? And so I started looking at the old Latin manuscripts. Lo and behold, many old Latin manuscripts have Mary's changed to Martha, or they will say that Mary did something that your Bible said Martha did. I said, whoa. And so I looked at as many manuscripts as I possibly could. I think it was about 150 in John. And I also, as a control to make sure it wasn't just the name Mary and Martha looking similar, I looked at the Gospel of Luke and I did a study of all the manuscripts in Luke that I could get a hold of, usually from Theological Library. You can find these transcriptions. And I compared them. And it was very clear that John had something happening where there's a lot of Mary's changed to Martha's throughout, not just Papyrus 66 in the Old Latin, but throughout the entire textual transmission. You can find 13th century manuscripts where you have the name Mary, where maybe Mary is serving the supper in John 12, where you would expect Martha to be doing that. Or I was looking at church fathers, because that's one of the other things I studied in my degree. It turns out that church fathers were saying things like, oh, yes, Mary said the tomb stank. And you're like, what? In my Bible, Martha said the tomb stank. So I basically collected as many of these as I could. I put it into my master's thesis, and I submitted it to the Harvard Theological Review, which again was like maybe a little bit ambitious.
Yes, it's a rare thing that the Harvard Theological Review publishes bits of master's theses.
Right. And Deirdre actually said you should write to them and tell them you're just a master's student and sort of ask if it's okay. And they wrote back, they said, well, as long as it's within the word limit, it's okay. So I submitted it, and astoundingly, it made it through the peer review process. And I found out later that my most rigorous, like, second reviewer was Eldon Epp, who is one of the most towering textual critics of the 20th century. And he gave it a very glowing review. He said, I have no idea who wrote this, but this person has shown that it's possible that Martha was added. So the name of the master's thesis was Martha of Bethany added to the fourth gospel in the second century. And so it was published in this top tier journal, the Harvard Theological Review. And at that point, people started to say to me, well, where are you going to do your PhD? And I was like, I'm a musician. I just wanted you to see this thing in Papyrus 66 that nobody had paid attention to. But lo and behold, Mary Magdalene had hijacked my life. I am not really, I mean, I can do music if people ask me to, but now my whole life is taken over by academia. And now, so I ended up going to Duke for my doctorate, which is partly how you and I connected, because we both went to Duke and you saw my work talked about in Duke today. And then after I defended at Duke in 2023, I got a tenure track job at Villanova University. And I didn't even know they were going to have a pope when I got that job. And so
they do have a pope.
now we got a pope. So now I'm an assistant professor of New Testament. The whole thing is very strange.
And so the reason I call it the single sister thesis, obviously, is that you have proposed that there is only one sister to the what is usually seen as the Bethany threesome, the Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And you say there was no Martha, and that's in your title. Was Martha added?
Not in John.
In the fourth century, in John, that's right. In Luke, there's a Mary, Martha, different women, different place, different story. So there is the sisters still exist, but those are two very common names in this ancient time. So you say that in the Gospel of John, only one woman who is the sister of Lazarus. The chapter John chapter 11 should be understood to be about that one woman and her brother who Jesus raises from the dead. And that's the single sister thesis. That woman is Mary Magdalene.
Well, you can't prove that, but you can demonstrate that people thought so. A lot of
Yes.
people thought so in antiquity. You have people as early as Hippolytus of Rome assuming that Mary of Bethany is Mary Magdalene.
Right.
St. Ambrose in the fourth century, a lot of people assume that Mary of Bethany was Mary Magdalene. Whoever wrote the Gospel of Mary, which is a second century text, is incorporating particular aspects of Mary of Bethany, which is that, Jesus loves her and she's crying, right, with Mary Magdalene, who has a vision of Jesus. So it seems that as far back as we can go, people who had read John were assuming that Lazarus's sister Mary was Mary Magdalene. And so then you got to say, like, well, why would somebody add Martha to this story? I mean, the name Magdalene is nowhere in John chapter 11, but that's the story of the raising of Lazarus. But there are some really obvious clues that the Mary in the Lazarus story is very similar to Mary Magdalene. They're both a woman named Mary who's crying as they see somebody they love dearly rise from the dead. Jesus asks uh, Mary, "Where have you laid him?" in John 11, talking about Lazarus. But in John chapter 20, the encounter between Mary Magdalene and Jesus, Mary Magdalene says to Jesus, "Where have you laid him? I do not know where you have laid him." So there's all these sort of mirror issues happening that scholars have noticed for a long time. Look at these similarities. It seems that John 11 is uh, anticipating John 20. And so you're like, why did the evangelist do that? Why did the evangelist make Lazarus' sister Mary so similar to Mary Magdalene? Oh gosh, my cat has decided to join the Zoom.
That's okay.
There she is. Yeah, that's okay. And so the question is, why would somebody add Martha to this story? And then you have to ask, okay, what is the thing that Martha does? What is Martha's main role in the Gospel of John? And it is that she gives the central thesis statement of the Gospel of John. It is called the Christological Confession. It is John 11:27. Jesus is dialoguing with this woman, and he says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And everybody knows that, right? Everybody kind of knows that quote with Jesus, and then, but they kind of forget who he's talking to. But it is Martha that responds with the thesis statement of John. "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." Okay. And that we know that's the thesis statement of John because it sort of has it kind of comes back at the end of John 20. It says these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, right? And Martha is the first person to outright say, "I believe that you are the Christ." Which is, of course,
One time I heard you say that, and I went back and I looked at the Gospel of John, and up until then, you actually have people who are saying, like the Samaritan woman at the well, and she says, "I met a man who told me everything I ever have done. Could it
could
be
it be?
that he is the Christ?"
Could it be?
Yeah, and so up until that point, people are saying, putting it always in a question form, or a kind of, do you think this is true? And then you get to chapter 11, and it's clearly stated, and that's how those Christological confessions work in each one of the Gospels. Of course, is that in effect that's one of the early high points in each Gospel, is somebody recognizes what's going on here. And
Although in the other three gospels,
yeah,
it's not just somebody, it's the
that's right. Go ahead. You do. Go ahead.
Peter,
It's
right?
Peter.
Matthew,
Right.
Mark, and Luke. It's Peter that says you are the Christ. Yeah.
Right.
And so John wrote a story. Most scholars these days think that John certainly knew Mark's gospel or had heard it. And some people think that John also had heard Matthew and maybe even Luke. Okay. But let's just say that John knows Mark. John knows that some gospels are saying that Peter is the one who confesses Jesus as the Christ. So John seems to be responding to that and maybe correcting it to some. A lot of people think this, that John is sort of showing people how it is and saying that a woman is the one who first recognizes Jesus as the Christ. But right now in your Bible, the woman who says it is sort of a forgettable woman. It's Martha. And after she says this and gets Mary, she kind of leaves and she's not really there anymore in the gospel. But here's the really central point. What if Mary was the person who confessed Jesus as the Christ? And what if you had read John a few times and you noticed how similar she was to Mary Magdalene, who definitely comes back, right? Later in the gospel. There is a church father, Tertullian, who wrote around the same time Papyrus 66 was copied, around 200, 210 AD. And he says that Mary confessed Jesus as the Christ. So in his second, third century copy, maybe Mary was the Christological confessor. The
Confessor. Yeah.
Mary was the Christological confessor in Tertullian's copy. And so you can see like that would be a real problem if you're reading John and you're like, okay, wait, so this Mary, who I've read John a few times, and I think she might be Mary Magdalene, because Lazarus' sister Mary is so similar to Mary Magdalene in John. We're not talking about in history. We're not talking about like comparing the other gospels. We're just saying the intention of John the evangelist. John has painted Mary of Bethany to be very similar to Mary Magdalene. Then she confesses Jesus is the Christ. She serves the supper. There are manuscripts that I cataloged where Mary serves the supper in John 12. And then, of course, she anoints Jesus, right?
Right.
In Bethany. And then Mary Magdalene is at the foot of the cross. She witnesses the crucifixion. And then on Easter morning, she goes alone to the tomb. Jesus appears only to her first and gives her a commission to announce to all the other disciples that he has risen. Okay, so she suddenly becomes a really central figure. Not only that, but the first person to clearly recognize Jesus as the Christ can be understood to be the first person who gets the appearance of the risen Jesus. Oh, so and those are roles that Peter is sort of competing for in antiquity, the Christological confession. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared first to Cephas. Okay. So in Christian circles, there's these debates happening of who did Jesus appear to first and who confessed Jesus as the Christ. And I'm saying that someone who knew about these debates may have seen John's gospel and seen a problem. Because if John is saying that this woman named Mary confessed him as the Christ, and people are thinking that she's the first person that Jesus appeared to, and that she didn't abandon him at the cross like Peter did, right? Uh-oh, then she's a really prominent, really important central character in this
Yeah.
gospel. And
I
so,
think that's a really key point that Peter does actually abandon Jesus in
hmm.
at the cross.
Yes,
And I mean, I think that even comes back into play in John chapter 21, which is probably a chapter that was added later
yes,
to the Gospel of John.
yes.
And there you have Jesus bringing Peter back in. It's almost like a coda, where, but Mary never left. If that's this same woman, and it's Mary Magdalene, it meant that the woman was the faithful confessor, the faithful servant, the faithful anointer, the faithful witness, and the faithful proclaimer. Well, the guys ran off and said, well, we don't know if we believe this. And they locked themselves behind doors because they were afraid.
Right.
I
And so
mean, it's a really hilarious story from from the perspective of gender, if you want to play with that some.
yeah, and so I can see someone who's reading John, who understands precisely what John is doing and says, this is a problem. But
Right. You can see
maybe,
that.
yeah. And we actually know that John was being debated in the second century. There's a question as to whether John should be considered as Orthodox.
Right.
And so Irenaeus advocates for John at the end of the second century. And he advocated for the fourfold gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Irenaeus, around 180, advocated for that, for orthodoxy. And aren't we glad that he did? Because we have John. But I'm wondering if someone around that time said, you know, we like this gospel, we like John, but we can't accept this figure. And you know, John does say the spirit of truth cannot be received. Isn't that interesting? So someone says, I have a solution. You know, there's only one letter's difference between the names Maria and Martha. And, you know, I read Luke's gospel. And in Luke, there's Maria and Martha, these two sisters. What if I were to just sort of take Martha from Luke and plop her into John and give her the Christological confession? Okay, now it's a minor, non-threatening character who confesses Jesus is the Christ, and she's not the same person. Nobody can say that that's the same person as the first person who got the appearance of the risen Jesus. So now Martha Martha sort of solves the problem. She's sort of acting as a decoy, distracting the reader into Luke. Instead of the reader noticing how very similar Lazarus's sister Mary is to Mary Magdalene in John's arc of the story, as soon as they see that word Martha, they will be redirected. Oh, those sisters Mary and Martha, I love them. I love that story, of, Mary sitting quietly at Jesus's feet and, she's chosen the better part. It will not be taken from her. And Martha is busy and distracted. So the reader is redirected into Luke to think about that story. And now Lazarus' sister Mary is no longer Mary Magdalene. Now she is Martha's quiet sister from Luke's gospel. So basically, Mary Magdalene um, has been sort of fragmented into three women. Now it's Mary and Martha, who we also know from Luke, as well as Mary Magdalene, three different women in John, as opposed to Lazarus' sister Mary, who seems really similar to Mary Magdalene. So it changes the story and it dilutes the potency of this central character in John.
Yeah, and I think that that becomes really important, obviously, in the longer history of women in Christianity, because I hadn't thought about it until you just said it. But if you do introduce the the quiet Mary
Mhm.
as being the Mary character in the Gospel of John, that it sort of takes away the potency of her being the apostle to the apostles.
Yes.
Because then it's just like, oh well, Jesus happened to show up. She was the one who happened to be there. He had to tell somebody to go and tell the disciples, and so this was the one exception to the rule of sort of women speaking. Because look at what else she does. She shows up almost like a medieval nun in the Mary and Martha story, because she's the one who's the intellectual. She's the quiet one. She's kind of away in the house with Jesus. And so if I was reading that story, say in the Middle Ages, I would see her as being the perfect example of a nun, a cloistered nun, rather
We have
than,
read it that way.
yeah, I think people have read it that
And it's
way.
generative. It's a generative reading. It's not wrong to read it that
Right.
way.
But it's wrong to link it with the wrong characters
Hmm.
and to use that as an excuse, I think, to mute the power of the woman in the Gospel of John.
I think that the intention originally was to mute and distort the
Right.
story. Um, of course, the way that it's been read in Christian history has generated a lot of goodness. And so it's interesting because even though my thesis was that what I just said to you was published in the Harvard Theological Review and it has made an impact, which we're going to talk about, um, it's not a proof. I haven't proven that Martha was added to the Gospel of John. I have just gathered a great deal of evidence indicating that Martha's presence is quite unstable in the textual transmission of John 11 and 12, and given a reasonable hypothesis for why that might be the case. Why would someone add Martha and where did she come from? She maybe came from Luke, and she might have come precisely because Mary was a controversial figure in the second century, as we know from apocryphal texts that have been discovered in the last century, like the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas. They all indicate that there was something controversial around Mary happening
Right.
precisely in the second century, that Mary was seen as a prominent follower, sometimes Jesus' closest, most intelligent follower in some of these texts. And so you could see someone who's wrestling with this in the second century, trying to find a solution. And so, in some ways, I think that it's possible that Martha got added to John's gospel to ensure that John was suitable for the canon, for the Orthodox canon. And so, in that way, it's sort of a compromise. And as I was saying earlier, maybe the spirit of truth could not be received at that time, as John very clearly states for us. But this maybe was something that needed to happen to the text. I know if I am right, it's just a thesis, it's not a proof. If I am
Right.
right, it's tempting to get angry or to demand that, the one sister version be the authoritative one. But I think there's something theological almost in the change, in the in seeing the two stories side by side and seeing, well, this is what people needed at that time. That's what they needed for this gospel to survive. Because
Yeah.
if there had been an insistence on keeping Mary as this really prominent character, the Gospel of John might have gone the way of the Gospel of Mary, which is to just be suppressed and people would not talk about it. This way, John survived.
It's an interesting, I mean, that's actually an interesting thing that happens a lot in church history.
Mhm.
There's a common argument, really kind of a fight among people who do more of what I do as church historians, and that is, was Constantine's acceptance or approval of Christianity in the fourth century good or bad for
Mhm.
Christianity? And so there's tons of mythological stuff that's told about that. We don't really know what Constantine's own personal faith was. I mean, it's historically it's kind of a mess, but there are suppositions that we can make that we think that we have some basics of the story. But then, if Constantine hadn't accepted Christianity or hadn't legalized it or legitimized it in the
Yes,
way that he did as emperor, it's a very good possibility that Christianity would not have survived at all.
that's a great analogy.
the
Yes,
the
great analogy.
collapse of the Roman Empire. And so you go, well, wait a second here. If Because I don't really like Constantine. I think that he did a lot of bad
He
stuff,
did
and
horrible. He killed his
we're
wife and his son. Not a
we're
nice guy.
we're still dealing with imperial sorts of interpretations and authority and all the stuff that that Constantine did. Augustine too, but
Well,
Constantine
Augustine, I mean,
did.
Villanova's Augustinian, and every day I hear all the wonderful things that Augustine did, which he did. He did.
Right.
He's one of the most intelligent people who ever lived.
Right. And so this is a common sort of struggle that historians of Christianity just go through, is that we have to look at what is the most reasonable hypothesis of what is, because you can't go back into history and ask the people. We don't have a time machine to witness the actual events, so you have to do what you did. You have to gather evidence, you have to present a reasonable thesis, you have to say, this is what I think is the closest thing that this text or this event or this relationship or what have you was all about. And then once you get to that point, a vigorous discussion ensues
Yes.
um, about, well, what about this, and what about this possibility, and what about this potential timeline? And so what's I see happening with this work now, I really honor the fact that you're always careful to tell people this is a thesis.
Mhm.
That's like the thesis of evolution, or this is a thesis like, Constantine's conversion, or what have you. There are theses like this in science, and there are theses like this in history. And the point of a thesis is that you pick a good one and you live with it for a while, and
Mhm.
you kind of begin to see what the results of it are and what the potential impacts of it are.
I
And that is one of the things that begins to sort of validate the truthfulness of a thesis as well, is reception. And so I really wanted to ask you to go through this uh, as sort of as quickly as you possibly can, because I know people are really anxious to hear what's going on right now, why I had you on today.
Sure. So I will say that the reception has been generally positive, but somewhat mixed. So, for instance, a lot of people have started writing about my work in their commentaries. Like the Oxford
Wow.
Handbook of Johannine Studies mentions this thesis in it. Also, Alicia Meyer's wonderful commentary on the Gospel of John mentions it, or Mary Colo's wisdom commentary on John. So the commentaries have started to mention it, like, oh, it's possible that Martha was added. People have started to say that. Um,
Congratulations. That's a big deal.
Right. Yeah. And so and also there's been a little bit of pushback, usually from very conservative circles. There have been a couple of bloggers who don't like the idea, but I usually try to only engage with people whose work has been vetted by an outside peer reviewer or publisher. And so I will briefly talk about the work of Richard Fellows, who in TC, a Journal of Biblical Textual Criticism, argued that all of the variants are sexist and all of them are trying to diminish both Mary and Martha. but that both sisters were there the whole time. And some aspects of his argument are strong. I think that there were I had not really been trained as a textual critic when I wrote my master's thesis. And I think I went into like too much detail on, the ones that say his sisters versus the sisters. And so I think I went into too much detail. And he said, no, this is something that's just sexist, where you add the word his, or putting Lazarus at the top of the list is a sexist choice. Whereas I had argued that Lazarus should be first at the top of the list in John 11, verse 5. So we had a little debate in TC, a journal of textual criticism. He also said a couple of things that were quite misleading, unfortunately. Like he said that one of the most important manuscripts, Codex Alexandrinus, had a tendency to omit women's names. And that's why Martha's name doesn't appear in verse 1. But that's actually not the case. There's not actually a deliberate omission of women's names in Codex Alexandrinus. The examples that he gave were something that's called I skip, where you accidentally, like the same word, you skip from one to the next. And so it's like a pure accident that scribes always do this, or else it's called parablepsis. It's where you see one word and then you skip to the same instance of the next word in short succession. And that's why some names, women and men, were cut off. And so he was using that as evidence that Codex Alexandrinus purposely omitted women's names. And he actually knew that that was more likely to be a mistake. So it was a bit misleading of him to put that in the article. So anyway, we had a little debate in TC, a journal of textual criticism, and we responded to each other. And then there was also something by a guy named Daryl Post called Rescuing Martha that was published in it's something called like Bible archaeology, something like that, some website. And he actually did something very impressive. He looked at all of the manuscripts of John that are available. I think there's thousands of them, and he collated thousands of them. And he said, no, these are just mistakes. All of these things that are happening are just mistakes. But what's really interesting is that he seems to have found more evidence of tweaks around the names Mary and Martha. And so I'm like, oh, you found more examples that I hadn't even known about. And
So he's doing your work for you.
right. And the other thing is that he doesn't actually compare it with Luke. So what my Harvard Theological Review article did, which I think you must do, is to do an equal amount of work on the manuscripts of Luke's gospel. Are there confusions around the name Mary and Martha in Luke? I didn't find any in the Greek and Latin transmission. I looked at about 150 of them. So if he's going to look at a couple thousand manuscripts of John and say, oh, these are just mistakes, you must provide a control study. You have to do the same thing in a couple thousand manuscripts of Luke's gospel and tell me, are they different or are they the same? Because if you're saying that John has all these mistakes, and then you just don't even look at what's happening in Luke, then you have no argument. You just found one piece of evidence and said, this is what I believe it to be, without actually comparing it with a control study. So that's what was missing from his rescuing Martha. And so I think he actually just found more evidence of issues around Mary and Martha.
I think it must be fascinating to people who aren't trained academics to understand that this is really what is behind the Bible that you have on
Oh,
on
definitely.
your desk, is that there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of scholars who have done this kind of work on these ancient texts, and in translation, in historical context, in linguistic issues, in textual concerns, and that their work together, in a sense,
Yes.
over centuries has created the thing that we know as the Bible.
Yes, yes. And the Greek text is really the most important. A lot of people think that this is a translation issue, but it is not. We are talking about the Greek base text. We're talking about manuscripts in Greek that may have been changed. And so so translation isn't as much of a factor here in this. It's that's why Daryl Post's study was only focused on the Greek manuscripts, and I mainly focused on the Greek manuscripts in my work as well. So there has been some response, a little bit of pushback, but then we also have the work of Ali Kattouz. Ali Kattouz is an art historian who works on ancient Christian art, and she looked at, I think, over 100, maybe 200 ancient examples of the story of Lazarus. And sometimes it's just Jesus and Lazarus, a lot of the oldest depictions of the raising of Lazarus, in sarcophagi and catacombs, in reliquaries and things like that. But she finds that when there is a sister, 95% of the time, there's only one sister
That's
in the
amazing to
oldest
me.
artwork. Yeah. So this is like third and fourth century sarcophagi. And you anybody who decides to go to the Vatican in Rome and goes to I think it's the Pio Cristiano part of the Vatican Museum, go look at the sarcophagi. There's tons of them. And almost all of them, you will see that when there's a Lazarus little depiction at the end of the sarcophagus, it's Jesus, Lazarus, and one woman. It's like the vast majority of ancient artwork shows Jesus, Lazarus, and one woman when a sister is depicted. And so that's showing that this is interesting to me because it's telling us that not only in gospel manuscripts is Martha's presence unstable, not only in church fathers quotes like Tertullian is Martha's presence unstable, in the ancient artwork a second sister's presence is usually not there. So that's actually all the evidence that we have. Gospel manuscripts, patristic quotations, and early Christian art of the Gospels. Those three are converging in saying that there's some sort of problem around Martha. So Ali Cattouz had published this, I think, last summer. And around
I
this
saw it
time,
when she publishes a really interesting piece.
or maybe last fall. Yeah. And so around this time I was at a conference last August and I ran into the head editor of the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament and he said, "When will you come to Munster and present your work to us?" And I said, "I will come as soon as I can get there. Let me show you everything that I know." And so he invited me. We got out our calendars right
Okay, slow down. You're
there.
talking to people who don't know.
Oh, the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament. I should tell them.
What is okay, so there's all this amazing evidence that in it has sort of coalesced around the thesis you've presented,
Yes.
and that this conversation is going on now internationally with all
Yes.
these different scholars because you present a lot in Europe. I understand that it's the thesis is already showing up in divinity schools.
Yes.
That so that
They teach it on the Yale syllabus for the Gospel of John, the Yale Divinity School. That makes me happy.
Yeah, I definitely know that they're teaching it at Yale. I've heard that from any number of people who are at Yale now. But I imagine that means it's spreading to other places as well. It's become something that people are more popularly familiar with. Literally, Libby, I have had people come up to me when I've been talking about Mary Magdalene and said, "Have you ever heard about this thesis on this woman?"
Like,
It's
yes, I
like, yes,
have.
actually, I have heard about this. And so you're getting sort of the popular energy and the scholarly energy. And now you're at this conference and a fellow comes up to you, European scholar, and he says, "When are you going to come and present to us?" And then you threw out this fancy term that is he the head of the Nestle Allen Committee?
He's the head editor of the Nestle Aland Committee. Yes.
Okay, now tell people what Nestle Allen is and why it's important.
Okay, I've got it right here. This is the Novum Testamentum Graece, the Greek critical edition from which most Bibles are translated. Your NIV, your NAB, your NRSV, like all of these sort of the usual translations into English, into French, into Swahili are made from this Greek critical edition. And they've been making these editions and updating them every 15 to 20 years since I think the late 19th century. And the person who got it started was Eberhard Nestle. And so they are now on the 28th edition. This one is from 2012. This is the one that I worked with when I went to seminary at General Theological Seminary. But as I
Right.
mentioned, whenever new scholarship comes out, oh, it sort of needs to be updated with the latest information. For sometimes a new papyrus will be discovered and they will have to, incorporate it into the critical edition, or someone will make an argument and they have to think about that argument and like acknowledge it, or else there will be like a new methodology. There's something they're doing called the coherence-based genealogical method that leads them to come to a different conclusion. And so the way that it works is that they have so here's Galatians, okay? And so this is the main text that the editors over a century of editors have kind of been working on this, and they update it every once in a while. It's a team of scholars, usually 5 or 6 scholars, who vote and they say, this is what we think that Paul wrote. Okay. This is the main text. And you see it's in Greek because Paul wrote in Greek, right? But down here, ooh, what's this? This is called the apparatus. You could call it the footnotes. And it's basically saying, you know what? Different manuscripts say different things. As we were talking about with the scribe of Papyrus 66, even in the second century, scribes were encountering and sometimes creating alternate readings because there's no printing press, right? So they want to acknowledge different readings that you find in really important manuscripts. So, like this little symbol here means Codex Sinaiticus. This means Codex Alexandrinus. This means Codex Bezae. These are some of the most important, Codex Vaticanus. These are some of the most important manuscripts in the world. And so they acknowledge, okay, these manuscripts might say something a little different, but we think that this is what Paul wrote. Okay, so the footnotes are, and these footnotes do eventually show up in, let's say, your New Revised Standard Version.
I was
Okay,
gonna just grab mine. That's what I was looking for
right. And
because
so
they're in our English Bibles as well.
that's right. So here's Galatians, and you might see here, like, let's say that you're looking at the footnotes. Here's Galatians 4. It says, other ancient authorities read. Okay. That's telling you that different manuscripts say different things. They're not going to tell you in your footnotes, oh, Codex Alexandrinus reads blah, blah, blah. It just says other ancient authorities read. And so that's a clue. So your footnotes of your study Bible
Give
will
you the
tell
alternative.
that different
Yeah.
manuscripts say different things. It's not as complete as the Greek critical edition. Translators choose which are the ones that they think they should flag for readers. But so these footnotes matter. These footnotes really matter because you can actually see that in your study Bible, the reader will be aware that different manuscripts said different things in antiquity.
And a lot of times when preachers are working with, even a preacher who doesn't generally go to the Greek original. Not all preachers do. Lots of preachers work just out of the English Bible, which is okay if you're using a really good
Mhm.
English Bible that comes from that little blue Bible, that Greek edition that you were just holding up.
Mhm.
Um, and I think a great example of this that people are quite used to by now is that during the Mark year of the lectionary, you get to the resurrection. You're Mark chapter 16, and I've heard people do this all over the place. Someone will say, "Well, the original ending of Mark was Mark 16:8, and everything after that was added at a later date." Well, the reason why that preacher knows that is because in the footnotes, there's a
Yes.
very clear marking in the English Bible saying the best texts of Mark end right here. And then it says everything past this point was added at a later date. And it says that in the footnotes. And
Mhm.
so we also get other examples of this that are very commonly preached on. The name Junia, and that's the woman's name in Rome, that was originally a male name. That's
Romans
it.
16:7. Well, actually, it was everyone acknowledged that it was a woman until people like Nestle started creating Greek critical editions. And they actually changed it has to do with an accentuation. So it's actually modern people that changed the accenting because they said, oh, that's impossible. There
Yeah.
couldn't have been a woman who was an apostle. So they
And then they
changed it in
changed
the
it
modern
back.
critical editions, and that had to be corrected. Actually, Eldon Epp
Yeah.
is one of the main people who corrected that,
Yeah.
alongside Bernadette Bruton.
So
They did that.
so it's just fascinating that this text, the little blue book,
Mhm.
and that those footnotes are really part of the everyday conversation
Yes.
of pretty much any preacher who is worth their salt.
Yes.
They read that stuff, and then it comes to you as the listener if you're not a preacher, if you're not a scholar of the Greek New Testament. And so that's the guy you were talking to, the person
Yes.
who is the
Well,
editor of
yeah,
that
and there's
little blue book.
there's a team of editors, and it has changed over the last century or so that it has been in existence. And so there's a team of scholars who get together and they make updates, right? They say, is there anything that we need to update for the next edition? So I showed you the Nestle Aland 28th edition. The 29th edition is about to go to press.
That's amazing. I can't
Yes.
believe that. Oh my
Yeah, and
gosh.
so I just happened to, be making friends with these people and publishing my research around the time that they're preparing the 29th edition. And so I ran into this scholar in Germany, and he said, "When will you come to Münster?" It's Münster, the University of Münster, that they make these decisions. Although the scholars aren't all based in Münster, some are British. At times they have been American or Greek or Italian. They've had different people over the years. And I said, well, let's get our calendars. And so we sat right down, and I said, my fall break is the first time I can come. So we made a plan, and I got a ticket, and I went to Münster, and I gave this presentation at the Institute for Neutestamentliche Forschung, the INTF, the Institute for New Testament Research. And I gave this presentation giving the state of the conversation. So I summarized, of course, my Harvard Theological Review article, but I also talked about the work of Richard Fellows and his and my sort of conversation, and also Daryl Post, and also Ali Kattouz. And I said, these are the people who are having these conversations. There's also a scholar named Piotr Jokowicz who had noticed that an old Syriac manuscript gives special emphasis to Mary of Bethany. So these are sort of the peer-reviewed or published articles that are having the conversation. And I summarized it for them. I said, this is the state of the conversation. And I said, it seems to me as though the thing that we really must be paying attention to here is that the question of Martha's presence is unstable in these three venues. That is gospel manuscripts. And I found other ones because every time I look, I find more. I'm like, oh, and here's like 10 more where there's problems, right? And of course, Daryl Post had found more as well, right?
Right.
So there's gospel manuscripts that show inconsistency around Martha's presence. There's church fathers who show inconsistency, that like John Chrysostom or Tertullian says something about Martha that doesn't match what your Bible says. They're giving it to Mary when your Bible would give it to Martha. So there's church fathers, and then we have all this ancient artwork, and I showed many examples of reliquaries and sarcophagi where there's only one sister, and talked about Ali's work, emphasizing that that's the most standard in the third and the fourth century. And so I said, these things are all converging, and we cannot forget, of course, Nag Hammadi, texts like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Thomas, also the Gospel of Mary, that are all telling us that Mary is a controversial figure in the second century. So there is a clear motive for why someone might want to make sure that Mary doesn't have too big of a role, not too big of a star in John's gospel. And so I basically acknowledged all of the arguments. I said, this is the state of the conversation. And I made recommendations. I said, I know you're working on Nestle Aland 29 right now. And these are the places that I think we really need to make updates in the footnotes. That if you turn to John 11 in this one, there are missing variants. Because the thing is that they can't actually include every single example in this. That would be far too big of an exercise. They're doing that in something called the Editio Critica Maior, where each gospel or each book of the Bible has like, you know, 4 volumes. Because they're trying to literally capture the entire transmission, and it's like 1,000 pages for each gospel. So they're not going to do that in this pocket edition that most people are going to get access to. The pocket edition is the one that people need to be looking at. And so I said, in this pocket edition, you have not highlighted the readings of Papyrus 66 in John 11:1 or Codex Alexandrinus in John 11:1. You haven't highlighted that in John 11, verse 5, a lot of times Mary is listed first in the list, or sometimes it's just Lazarus and Mary. So I said, these are my recommendations, that you update John 11, verse 1, John 11, verse 3, and John 11, verse 5. And I said, these are my recommendations. I also suggested that they put the manuscripts where Mary serves the supper in John 12.
Mhm.
They took all of my recommendations. I have been informed.
Okay, this is the news.
Yes, they took all of my recommendations for John 11. Okay. So in Nestle Aland 29, you will see that the apparatus looks different because of this presentation that I made in October in Germany. The apparatus will show Codex Alexandrinus and Papyrus 66 in John 11, verse 1, that Martha was not there in the original transcription. Okay. John 11, verse 3 will make it very clear that a woman's name was crossed out. It's interesting because NA 27 said that the name crossed out was Mary. This one says that the name crossed out was Martha, but NA 29 is going to say MAR.A. We don't, it's totally scratched
You
out.
can't tell.
You can't actually be certain
Yeah.
what the woman's name was. So it's just going to say there's a woman whose name has been scratched out and all the verbs were changed from singular to plural. It will say that. Um, and then John 11:5 will show all the different versions of the list of Bethany's siblings' names. That's not in there at all in this one. In NA 29, it will show that sometimes Mary, it says it's a list of this Bethany siblings in John 11:5, and it will show that sometimes Mary is listed first. And sometimes Lazarus is listed first, and sometimes it just says Lazarus and his sister. It will show all of those things in the new footnotes. The reason that they didn't include my recommendations for John 12 is because the manuscripts are kind of late and obscure. And so they really only wanted to focus on the most crucial manuscripts in the footnotes, okay? Because that's how this works. They have to pick sort of the very most important manuscripts to highlight. And so they know that some manuscripts of John 12, Mary serves the supper, but the manuscripts are late and not as important. So it's really all my recommendations in John 11 that they took.
Yeah, the John
Big, exciting
12
announcement.
the John 12 1 and 2 piece, that's a tradition that is present in Eastern Orthodoxy, and it does show up in these later manuscripts. So there's what I suspect is going to happen now that this work has been done on John 11 and it's moved into the critical footnotes, is that people are going to start looking for John 12 manuscripts.
Well, the Editio Criticum Maior, the really big one that includes everything, it's like 1,000 pages long. That one will certainly acknowledge that some
John,
copies of John 12 say that Mary served the supper. That one is more comprehensive. This one
right,
is like the pocket edition. Um,
right.
yeah.
Well, I gotta say this is pretty exciting because when we first talked about this 4 years ago, one of the things I mean, I got so excited. I said, "Well, what's going to happen here?" And you thought that there were a couple of different possibilities. One is that nothing would happen, as that it would just continue to be a conversation that a few people, sort of around the fringes of academia, were interested in having. Two, you did think that there was a possibility that the footnotes of the Nestle Allen might be changed. And then the third possibility was that the text itself would be changed. And I remember the conversation as clear as a bell. You said if I were to put money on this or something to that effect, I would suspect that in my wildest dreams, the second one would be the option that the scholarly community would pursue at this time. And there you have it.
And it's happened. So this is a huge, I have to say, this is perhaps the biggest progress for the role of women in Christianity has ever, how do I say this? I think that as far as progress being made on potential changes to women's roles in the New Testament, this is the biggest one to date that is now being acknowledged at the highest levels of scholarship. I'd say that this is a bigger deal than the Junia one,
Right.
because the issue with Junia was something with modern critical editions changing the accents. It was basically calling out modern scholars for being anachronistic and assuming that Paul could never have called a woman an apostle, even though Junia was a very clearly a woman's name, and all the church fathers like John Chrysostom assumed that it was a woman that was being referenced. It was really modern people that were doing these anachronistic things. This is different. There's an acknowledgement. Again, it's not a proof, but it is an acknowledgement that there may have been a change, a major change to the text of John chapter 11 as far back as the transmission can be traced to around the 2nd century. So I don't think that the Nestle Aland committee would say, I have proven that Martha was added, but I think I have persuaded them that both one sister and two sister text forms were simultaneously circulating, because that is the best explanation for why a lot of the artwork has only one sister and why there's all this inconsistency around which sister does what thing. We have never found a manuscript where Martha is totally absent. And that is why you won't get it in the main text. Because all manuscripts, Martha is there. Papyrus 66, Martha is there. Okay? Every copy Martha is there. And so, unless something were to be unearthed, an authentic, true manuscript that where Martha is simply absent from the Lazarus story until then, we are going to have a text with Martha in it above the line. But the footnotes will acknowledge if you what I really love about what they've done in John 11 is that with these textual variants, you can reconstruct John 11 verses 1 through 5 without Martha, using real readings from real manuscripts in the most credible Greek edition that is used by the most people on the planet. Okay. So the reconstructed text, which you can use by putting together Codex Alexandrinus, Papyrus 66, and Codex Colbertinus. Here's the alternate text of John 11, 1 through 5. There was a
Right.
certain sick man, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary, his sister. That's from Codex Alexandrinus. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and who wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother was sick. This is of course what any Bible says today. Verse 3. Therefore, Maria sent to him. There's like a little dot in there, but if only Mary was mentioned in verse 1, you would assume that the woman's name is Maria. Therefore, Mary sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, the one you love is sick. When Jesus heard, he said to her, the illness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, in order to glorify the Son through it. That's the reading of Papyrus 66 before it is corrected. And then John 11, verse 5. Now Jesus loved Lazarus and his sister. That's the reading of Codex Colbertinus. All of those variants will be available in the footnotes, which means that if you cobble them together, you can reconstruct an alternate text form of John 11, 1 through 5, where Lazarus only has one sister. And it's an acknowledgement that there is a decent chance that a one sister text form of John did circulate in antiquity. That's basically the place that we're at right now that I think this critical edition is acknowledging.
And what that will open up for the future is if those are the first five verses of the Gospel of John, and there is John chapter 11, and there's only one sister, then the thread has to be pulled through the entire scene. It has to go through the entirety of John 11 up through the first, what is it, first 8 verses of John chapter 12.
Yeah,
Um,
for John 12:7. Yeah.
yeah, through the end of the anointing. And
Yes.
then this woman disappears from the text again until John chapter 19. Um,
If you assume she is the same woman as Mary Magdalene, which we know many people did, and which we are welcome to do because John invites us to do so. The woman who anoints Jesus, Mary, Jesus says, let her save this ointment for the day of my burial. And there's only one woman named Mary at Jesus's tomb, and that is Mary Magdalene. It
in
is
the
a very
Gospel of
obvious
John.
connection
Right.
that John invites us to make without stating it explicitly.
Right. And that's in the tradition. I mean, there's all those other places where that possibility shows up. And there are church historians, as you well know, because you've worked with some of them, who have worked on the meaning of Magdalene, what that name is, and
Yeah,
why
it doesn't.
potentially it might not be in John chapter 11 for various and sundry reasons.
Yes, and I should just briefly say I did co-write this article with Joan Taylor in the Journal of Biblical Literature, talking about the meaning of the word Magdalene. Magdala just means tower. And the question is whether, a lot of people think it's Mary of Magdala, that she came from a town called Tower. But in fact, there were many towns called Tower of this, Tower of that. And there is no indication that anybody thought that Mary Magdalene came from a place by the Sea of Galilee until the 6th century. So, and we also have evidence of people like Peter of Alexandria around 300 AD, St. Jerome around 400 AD. They assumed that it was a nickname, Mary the Tower. They assumed that Mary herself was given a nickname, the Tower. So I would plead for people to no longer reference Mary of Magdala because that implies that she's from this place by the Sea of Galilee that people today can visit that's called Magdala that has a synagogue. Yes, it was a Jewish city, but actually in the first century it was called Taraké.
Yeah, it wasn't called
It
Magdalene.
wasn't even called Magdala at that time. So it's we can't be absolutely certain, but it is just as likely that the word Magdalene means Mary the Toweress.
Well, Libby, again, sort of my mind is blown. I'm sitting here with you on the Zoom call, and when you're explaining about the Nestle Allen footnotes, which sounds like potentially what a geek we sound like, really.
I know.
Wait, but you're explaining about the Nestle Allen footnotes. I felt like I was going to cry because this is the kind of legitimization of scholarship. This kind of stuff happens maybe once in a generation. I mean, this is not the most common thing in the world. Those 29 editions of this critical edition of the Bible, this is spread out over more than a century's worth of work. So it's not like they're revising it every single year. This is a major deal in New Testament scholarship. And to have a proposal based on one's research accepted by this incredible group of scholars from across the globe who are the experts in this in the creation of this critical edition um, is nothing short of astonishing.
Mm.
And yeah, see, I'm getting really filled up. I mean, this is in certain ways a real fulfillment of this passion
Mm.
that you just sort of crazily developed because you wrote a song about Mary Magdalene. And then my favorite part of the story that you didn't tell today is you went to, was it the Brooklyn Library and checked out a copy of Mary Magdalene for Dummies?
The Complete Idiot's Guide to Mary
The
Magdalene.
complete idiot's guide to Mary Magdalene. That was the first thing that you read.
Yes, yes. And now I'm like an expert on Mary Magdalene. The whole thing is a bit strange. But I think one of the other reasons why it means so much is that it's sort of an acknowledgement at the highest levels of credibility, um, that there may have been some sort of diminishment of women's roles, which so many have felt. And it continues to echo to this day, just what happened the other week with the Southern Baptist Convention and their banning women pastors. For so many women, it feels so wrong. But there's something, it's sort of a competing truths. God has always wanted it that way. The Southern Baptist Convention says we're being true to God's word. And I say, are you being true to God's word, or are you being true to those in positions of power who would change God's word to serve their end and then call it gospel?
Right.
And so this opens up the possibility at the very highest levels that at the beginning in the second century, a woman's central role in John's gospel was mutilated, changed, suppressed to serve the interests of those who needed Peter to have the main spotlight. And if Mary were to have a similar role, that would be unacceptable. So it's saying it's taking it back to the very, very beginning of Christian origins and how things, the way that we assume like the Bible is clear or that, I mean, do the Southern Baptists care about what John wrote? Is that what's most important to them? Because if so, we have opened up the possibility here that what John wrote was changed in the service of those in power who did not like what the gospel had to say. And there is a parallel in what's happening today with women who feel called to preach. And Diana, you have shown better than anyone the power of a woman to preach. Is that what they're so worried about? Is that what they're so worried about? Is that what people in the second century were worried about? This is this opens up the possibility that we can now we don't have a complete copy of John without Martha there, but we now sort of have permission to really engage with the possibility of what a one sister version of the Lazarus story means and what the ramifications are in the gospel and in church history. We have permission to start exploring that with full credibility. Not to say that they have said that Martha was added, but I think that they are acknowledging that both versions circulated. So let's think about what would it mean with only one sister and what would it mean with two sisters. That's something that I think, now have full permission to explore.
And you bring up the example of the Southern Baptist, which is very important. And I keep thinking about the way in which this could potentially reframe the Catholic conversation, as well, about women in the church. And I always try to stay out of that because as a Protestant woman, it's like, um, the Catholics, they do their work, and they I think that they have done so much of their work really well. But what this opens up for their tradition, and I want to be as gentle with this as I possibly can be, but I know there are Catholics who are listening to us that are already thinking this. I'm quite sure of it. Is if there were multiple copies, multiple sets of stories, the single sister story and the two sister story, that means that there were two traditions that were
Hmm.
floating around the early church. And one of the things that the Catholic Church really cares about is that continuation of tradition. And here it's not just saying that there was a mistake in the 16th century, but you're actually pointing towards the possibility of multiple traditions near the very beginning.
Long before Constantine.
Right, long before Constantine. I mean, and if the scribe is working around the year 200, that means that those manuscripts are floating around within 100 years after
Yeah,
Jesus dies.
right.
And so this is a very old tradition that this reconstruction of John 11 is pointing to. And that's what Catholics care about. They really care about scripture and tradition and the interlacing of those two things in the making of theology at a very profound level. And this this is this to to have this tradition, and it's not a Nag Hammadi tradition. It's not a tradition that's separate from the authorities that the Catholic Church has already accepted.
That's right. All we're talking about here are manuscripts of John.
Right, right. And that's the canon of the New
It
Testament.
is indeed.
And so that does indeed, like I said, I don't know that it opens new questions for them, but I do think it reframes some of their ancient questions in ways that may prompt a kind of even a renewed discussion about the role of women, particularly, I think, imagine around the diaconate would be
Would be.
the the strongest conversation that could emerge in the Catholic circles out of this. But again, I'm speaking as an outsider there and just a person who is a historian who understands a little bit about the way that one of the well, the largest communion in all global Christianity has made these decisions. And
And I'm
this,
happy to talk with them about that. It's interesting that I landed at a Catholic university. I'm
right.
Episcopalian. But I think that the positioning, there's a lot of things in this journey that have been very odd and spirit led, I think. And so here I am, okay, I'm hanging out at a Catholic university. Oh gosh, it's where the Pope went to school. Oh wow, I'm getting trainings by some of the Pope's besties. Like that's kind of wow, that's not something that I was expecting as I began this journey. It seems almost like it just doesn't even seem real how these
Yeah.
things have been lining up. Um, and so if those conversations come, I think what I would want to do first is to listen.
Right. That's my thought too, is that I find this just enormously exciting and incredibly suggestive. And as both a historian and as an author, I mean, I really do understand myself as a writer, that the the narrative flow of the Gospel of John just it blossoms in unexpected ways just by this introduction of these five verses and the different possibilities that they hold. And so I think that there's great enthusiasm with the text, but there also, I think, also has to be what I would call a tenderness too.
Agree. I
About,
agree. And in those verses, the one that has always popped out for me is John 11, verse 4. Uh, in Papyrus 66, the first transcription was when Jesus heard, of course, we're talking about the illness of Lazarus. When Jesus heard, he said to her, this illness is not unto death, but it is for the glory of God, in order to glorify the Son through it. And I see the Gospel of John operating both on the micro level and on the macro level with this central statement of Jesus. This illness, yes, of course, he's talking about Lazarus's illness, but what about this perhaps an illness in the textual transmission, an illness in the gospel, this illness that has afflicted humanity of misogyny, of oppression, of forcing one's will upon others, of of quieting, of silencing women. This illness is not unto death. It is for the glory of God. Now, that's a really big thing to say. I'm saying that if we read that quote of Jesus as referencing what I'm talking about, a potential corruption in the textual transmission, it's that Jesus knows it is there. Jesus knows it is there. And as the body, just as Jesus's body was wounded by human sin, this text, the word has been wounded by human sin. This is me putting my theology hat on. Okay. So this is my textual critic historian hat. I put that aside. I'm putting my theology hat on. The word may have been wounded. And there's an allowance there because in this way, Mary has done exactly what John has asked. Because John 12 says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it cannot bear fruit. If Mary had insisted, no, that's my Christological confession, it could not have borne fruit. This character had to fall into the earth and die so that this gospel could spread all over the earth. And thus, there's something very Johannine in the trajectory of Mary laying down her life for us, for her friends. There is no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends. So, this character has died, and we may right now be witnessing this resurrection that is happening of this character. In fact, Jesus says, the one who serves me must follow me, in that very same quote. And it's that very same chapter that some manuscripts tell you who serves Jesus.
right? Mary
John
served.
12:2, many manuscripts say that Mary served Jesus. And just a few verses later in John 12, Jesus says, the one who serves me must follow me. Mary, I'm saying, followed him. She followed him into the dirt, into the grave, and allowed this illness to happen so that the glory of God can be shown. God works through human sin, through human selfishness, and even can operate around it for our salvation. We got the gospel. We got the gospel. And now, in fact, we have thousands of copies of them, and they can show us what happened. This to me
And
is
now
beautiful.
it's in the footnotes, or will be.
And now it's in, yes. So this to me is the theological aspect. And that is what I would like to talk perhaps to the Catholics about.
Well, I think that a lot of people are going to be talking about this as it continues to unfold, as the story continues to unfold. And it is truly remarkable. And this news is, I told people it was big news, and it is big news. Um, it's big news about little tiny letters at the bottom of a page that will make a difference, and it will show up one day in the Bibles that you have on your shelves in your desks, in that footnote form. And then you're going to have to figure out how to put it in your sermons and everything else. So,
Yes, it depends on the
congratulations.
translation committee, I have to say.
It
Like
does.
the NRSV has different translators than the ESV. So, the ESV might not want it, but your NIV or your NAB might put it in there. We'll see. Different
Yeah, no, that's right. That now what the next step will be each one of the different versions of the Bible has to decide how much of the notes that they'll put in the English versions. But we can count on, I think, pretty much the different really good study Bibles, Harper's and Oxford and stuff like that will most likely be including all of it.
They may
Um,
say some ancient witnesses lack Martha. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Well, Libby, it's been an extraordinary journey. It's been a really amazingly fun friendship we've developed around all this. And for anybody who has listened all the way to the end here,
Sorry, it's so long.
you might want to cut. No, it has to be a long one. You might want to make sure you get tickets to come to the Wild Goose Festival in North Carolina
Yeah.
because I may have first told Wild Goose about Libby and then followed it up a year later by telling them more about Libby. But this year, Libby and I are going to be together
Yeah, we'll be there together.
on stage at the Wild Goose Festival. And we're going to be talking about all of this, kind of where we both are now, where what the status of the research is. And I know that she'll be sharing um, with the Wild Goose Festival more about the Nestle Allen news as well.
Yes.
So I just want to say thank you to the amazing scholars in your larger community who have taken this seriously to heart
Yes.
and done their homework. It's been impressive to watch your work, but it's been equally as impressive to watch the scholarly concerns of people like the Nestle Allen Committee and other New Testament professors and art historians and church historians like me all of a sudden hear something new and understand that this has to be pursued.
Yes. Yes. That is now we leave it to you.
Well, it becomes work of a much larger community now that you initiated.
We
Um,
initiated.
well, of course, the Holy Spirit did it, and
We're
Mary
in.
Magdalene
Mother
probably did
Mary.
it
Yeah,
too.
we
She's
all did it together.
we all did it together. But wow, congratulations
Thank you.
are due, and I look forward to seeing you in September in North Carolina at Wild Goose, and then other places as our paths continue to unfold.
Yes. Thank you for having me, Diana. And thanks everyone for your interest.
Yeah. Oh, I know they're interested. You have a good afternoon, Libby, and thank you for coming and joining us.